Before this story begins, imagine standing in a quiet African village at sunset. The air is warm, children are returning from the stream, mothers are lighting their evening fires, and the smell of roasted maize drifts gently through the breeze. Everything feels peaceful, almost too peaceful. But behind that peace, somewhere in the tall elephant grasses nearby, someone is watching. Someone whose face looks harmless, yet whose intentions are anything but kind. Someone whose smile is soft, but whose heart is dark. This is the story of how young Kofi learned that not every friendly face deserves trust. Before we continue, make sure to subscribe to this channel so you don't miss more powerful African tales like this one. Kofi was 12 years old, small in size but full of life. In the village of Abrem, everyone knew him as the boy with the generous heart. He fetched water for elders, helped visitors feel welcome, and shared his food with anyone who was hungry, even if it meant having nothing left for himself. His grandmother, Mama Essie, always tried to warn him. She often told him that kindness was good, but blind trust could be dangerous. She said that a fish swims freely until it enters a net because it does not know when to be cautious. But Kofi, with his innocent mind, never truly understood what she meant. One golden afternoon, just as the sun was lowering into the horizon, Kofi picked up his woven basket. He told his grandmother that he was going to the forest edge to collect mushrooms before nightfall. Mama Ezzy looked at him with concern. She reminded him not to wander too far and told him that some villagers had reported seeing strange men near the farmlands. Kofi brushed off her worry, smiled, and hurried along the narrow path. The forest edge was one of his favorite places. It was peaceful and filled with the sound of birds. The light from the setting sun created warm patterns on the ground as it passed through the leaves. Kofi walked along the path humming softly and soon found a cluster of mushrooms growing near a fallen tree. He bent down to pick them, happy to see how fresh they were. Then he heard it, a soft crunch, a footstep behind him. Kofi slowly turned around. A tall man was walking out of the tall grass. His clothes were dusty, his beard unkempt, and he held a long wooden stick. A knife hung from his waist. But the first thing that caught Kofi's attention was the man's smile. It was wide, warm, and friendly. Too friendly. The man greeted him and said he was a herdsman who had lost his cows. He claimed he had been searching for them all day. Kofi relaxed a little. He told the man that he had not seen any cows, but the man simply nodded and maintained the same pleasant smile. The man then said he knew a hidden spot deeper inside the bush where mushrooms grew as big as water gourds. He encouraged Kofi to follow him. Kofi hesitated. Something about the man felt strange, but he looked harmless. He looked tired from walking, and he smiled so gently. Kofi pushed away his grandmother's warning and followed the man into the bush. They walked deeper and deeper. The trees grew thicker. The air felt colder. The forest, once alive with birds and insects, suddenly became silent. Even the wind seemed to stop moving. Kofi felt the hairs on his arms rise. He finally asked the man if they were close to the mushroom spot. The man did not answer. Kofi tried again, but the man kept walking until he suddenly stopped and slowly turned around. His smile was gone. His face was no longer friendly. His eyes were sharp and cold. He looked directly at Kofi, and his voice dropped into a dark tone. He said that Kofi talked too much. Kofi stepped back, frightened. His heart began to pound. The man tightened his grip on the stick. He said he had no cows. He said he was not a herdsman. Then he revealed the truth. He had been waiting for a child who wandered alone. Someone small, someone trusting, someone he could easily take. Before Kofi could react, the man grabbed his wrist tightly. Kofi struggled, begging the man to let go, but his grip was too strong. The man told him that someone would pay a lot of money to have him. He pulled Kofi closer while smiling again, but this time the smile was twisted and filled with cruelty. Terror shot through Kofi's chest. His grandmother's words echoed in his mind. He wished he had listened. He wished he had never trusted the stranger. But by the time he realized the danger, it was already too late. Kofi's heart pounded so loud he could hear it in his ears. The herdsman's rough hand held his wrist like iron, dragging him deeper into the forest. Every step they took carried them farther away from the familiar path, farther away from the voices of villagers, farther away from the safety of home. Shadows stretched across the forest floor, long and crooked, as if the trees themselves were warning Kofi to turn back. But he could not. The man pulled him along with quick, determined steps. Kofi stumbled several times, but the herdsman did not slow down. He moved with the confidence of someone who had walked this hidden path many times before. Kofi's mind raced. He tried to think of a way to escape. Should he scream? Should he run? Should he fight? But the man's grip was too tight. The forest was too deep, and his voice felt trapped inside his throat, frozen by fear. They reached a part of the forest Kofi had never seen before. The trees were so tall they blocked out the sky. The air smelled damp and heavy. The ground was covered with thick roots that twisted like sleeping snakes. Even the birds avoided this place. The herdsman finally stopped walking. He threw Kofi onto a patch of dry leaves. Kofi fell hard, his elbows scraping the rough ground. The man stood over him, breathing heavily, watching him with a cold, calculating expression. He began to search his pockets. Kofi could see the glint of the man's knife as it tapped against his waist. The herdsman pulled out a small rope, rough and brown, clearly prepared for this moment. He knelt beside Kofi and began tying his wrists together. While tying him, the man spoke in a low, emotionless tone. He explained that he had been moving from village to village, waiting for foolish children who wandered alone. He said that people in faraway towns paid well for small boys who could be forced into work. He said that Kofi was lucky he had not been taken earlier. Kofi felt tears burning in his eyes, but he forced himself not to cry. He remembered something his grandmother once told him, that crying does not save you, but thinking can. He took a slow breath. He needed to stay calm. He needed to look for a chance to run. When the man finished tying his wrists, he dragged Kofi to his feet again. He pushed him forward and began walking once more. This time, the path was narrower. Thorn bushes brushed against Kofi's skin. Sharp stones cut into his feet. The forest seemed to tighten around him like a closing fist. As they walked, Kofi looked for anything that could help him escape. A broken tree, a hole in the ground, a fallen branch. But the man was alert and kept glancing back, making sure Kofi did not try anything. After some time, they reached a small clearing. In the center of the clearing stood a wooden hut made from old planks and mud. Its roof sagged, and its door was barely hanging from its hinges. A faint smell of smoke came inside. It was obvious that someone lived there, someone who didn't want to be found. The herdsman pushed Kofi toward the hut. Inside it was dark. A single candle flickered on a wooden box, casting shaky shadows on the walls. A torn mat lay on the floor, and beside it was a pile of ropes and sacks. Kofi's stomach twisted. This was where the herdsman brought his victims. The man untied Kofi's ankles, but left his wrists bound. He then pushed him to sit on the mat. Kofi tried not to show fear, but the dim light made every shadow look like a threat. The herdsman stepped outside for a moment, muttering to himself. Kofi heard him shifting through something. Maybe bags, maybe tools, maybe more traps. Time was slipping away. The danger was rising. Kofi looked around the dim hut. His eyes landed on the candle. He noticed that its flame leaned slightly toward the left, a sign that air was entering from somewhere. He turned his head and saw a small gap in the back wall, a broken wooden plank, a hole barely big enough for a small boy to squeeze through. Hope flickered inside him, but his wrists were still tied. He slowly rubbed his wrists against the sharp edge of the mat's woven straw. It cut into his skin painfully. He swallowed the pain and continued. He pushed harder, scraping the rope, twisting it. His skin burned. The rope pressed deeper. But he did not stop. He kept going until he felt one of the fibers weakening. Outside, the herdsman's footsteps moved closer. Kofi worked faster. The rope dug into his skin. His wrists bled. But finally, with one last twist, the rope loosened. His hands were free. He quickly placed the rope in front of him to look as if he were still tied. The door creaked. The herdsman entered, carrying a large sack. He did not notice the loose rope. Kofi kept his head down, pretending to tremble helplessly. The man stepped closer, placing the sack beside him. Then he reached for Kofi's arm. That was the moment. Kofi launched himself backward, rolling toward the hole in the wall. The herdsman shouted and lunged at him, but Kofi had already slipped his legs through the gap. He scratched his skin on the broken wood, but he pushed through anyway. His heart hammered wildly as he crawled out of the hut and dashed into the darkness of the forest. Branches whipped against his face. Roots caught his feet. The forest was now a maze of danger and hope. Kofi did not stop. He ran as fast as he could, praying the man would not catch him. Behind him, the herdsman roared in anger. Kofi did not look back. He knew one thing now with painful clarity. He had to reach the village, or he would never be seen again. Kofi ran without knowing where his feet were taking him. All he knew was that he had to keep moving. The forest swallowed him in darkness, and the branches whipped across his face like thin whips. Every breath burned in his chest, and every step felt heavier than the last. Behind him, the herdsman's angry shouts echoed through the trees, bouncing from trunk to trunk like a warning. The forest became darker the deeper he went. The trees stood tall and silent, their shadows stretching long across the ground. The air felt colder, heavier. Even the insects seemed to sense the danger and kept quiet. Only the sound of Kofi's hurried footsteps broke the silence. He pushed through the undergrowth, stumbling over hidden roots. Thorns scratched at his arms and legs, leaving thin lines of blood. He did not stop. He could not stop. His escape depended on every quick decision, every moment of courage. After several minutes of running, Kofi paused behind a large tree, gasping for air. He pressed his back against the rough bark and tried to steady his breathing. Sweat dripped down his forehead and mixed with the dirt on his face. His clothes clung to him, damp from sweat and fear. He listened carefully. The forest was quiet again. He could no longer hear the footsteps of the herdsman, but he knew the man was somewhere behind him, watching, searching, hunting. Kofi peered through the trees. The forest here was unfamiliar. He had never ventured this deep before. He recognized none of the paths, none of the trees, none of the formations he had learned while picking mushrooms with his grandmother. Still panting, Kofi started to walk. He kept low, moving slowly now to avoid making noise. His legs trembled with exhaustion, but his mind refused to give up. Every step he took brought him closer to safety, or deeper into danger. A faint rustling sound came from his left. Kofi froze, leaves shifted, branches cracked softly. He crouched behind a low bush and held his breath. For a moment nothing happened. Then the sound grew louder. Something was moving in his direction. His heart raced. He pressed himself deeper into the bush, hoping the darkness would hide him. He prayed silently for protection. A shadow appeared between the trees. It was tall and broad. Kofi's blood ran cold. He thought the herdsman had found him, but when the figure came closer, he saw the shape more clearly. It was not walking. It was grazing. It was a goat, thin, quiet, alone. Kofi let out a shaky breath of relief. The goat stopped and stared at him with wide, curious eyes, as if sensing his fear. For a moment, Kofi felt comforted by the presence of another living thing that did not mean him harm. He whispered a silent thanks and continued moving. Minutes passed. The moon began to rise slowly above the treetops, casting a pale light over the forest floor. The soft glow helped Kofi see the path ahead, though the forest still felt unsettling. Shadows shifted like spirits moving in the dark. Then he heard another sound, a sound far more dangerous. Footsteps, real footsteps, slow, heavy, deliberate. The herdsman was still searching for him. Kofi's pulse quickened. He crouched low and scanned the area. He needed a hiding place, somewhere the man would not think to check. To his right, he saw a thick cluster of fallen logs. Their hollow centers formed dark spaces that could hide him, but the openings were small and risky. To his left, a shallow stream glistened faintly under the moonlight. The water was cold, but the stream bed might hide his footprints. Behind him, tall grasses swayed quietly. Kofi needed to choose. He chose the stream. He sprinted toward it, stepping lightly on the rocks to avoid splashing. The icy water numbed his feet instantly, but he kept going. He moved along the water's edge, letting the stream cover his tracks. His breaths came out in quick bursts, but he stayed focused. Suddenly he heard voices, not one voice, two. The herdsman was not alone anymore. Kofi pressed himself against the stream bank, lying flat. He felt the cold water rush past his fingers. He listened closely. One of the voices sounded impatient, the other deeper, more commanding. They were discussing something. He strained to hear. They were talking about him. They said the boy could not have gone far. They said the bushes had fresh footprints. They said he must still be somewhere in the forest. Kofi's heartbeat thundered in his chest. He remained absolutely still. The men's footsteps grew louder. They were getting closer. Kofi held his breath, every muscle tense. He could see their shadows stretching long across the stream bed. One of them stopped just a few feet away. Kofi closed his eyes tightly. He heard the man speak in a low tone, confident and cruel. The man said he would find the boy eventually. The man said children were weak, and they always panicked. The man said no one escapes him. Kofi felt tears sting his eyes, but he stayed silent. After a moment that felt like eternity, the men walked away in another direction, their voices fading deeper into the forest. Kofi remained still for several more minutes, unsure if they would return. When he finally felt safe enough, he slowly sat up, shaking from both cold and fear. He knew now that the danger was far greater than he imagined. The herdsman was not working alone. There were others. They knew the forest better than he did. They were patient. They would not give up easily. Kofi wiped his face and stood carefully, the moonlight reflected in the stream guiding him gently. He realized he had only one choice left. He needed to find a way back to the village before the men found him first. He took a shaky breath. He stepped out of the stream. He walked deeper into the forest, praying silently that dawn would come quickly. Kofi continued moving through the forest with slow, careful steps. His legs were weak and his chest felt tight from running. The night had grown colder, and a thin mist had begun to rise from the ground, swirling gently around him like pale smoke. Every tree looked taller, every shadow wider, every sound sharper than before. Fear followed him like a second heartbeat, thudding softly beneath his ribs. He kept glancing behind him, expecting at any moment to see the herdsman and his partner emerging from the darkness. The silence around him was unsettling. Even the insects were quiet, as if the forest itself were holding its breath. Kofi knew he had to keep moving until he found a familiar path. Somewhere in this vast forest was the trail leading home. Somewhere ahead was safety. But somewhere behind him, danger hunted. He pressed on. After some time, he reached a part of the forest where the trees were spaced farther apart. Thin beams of moonlight slipped through the gaps in the branches, lighting the path in patches. Kofi felt a small rise of hope in his chest. He was out of the densest part of the forest, and dawn would soon follow the moon. His hope, however, was short-lived. A soft sound broke the silence, a distant crack of a branch being stepped on. Kofi froze. He turned slowly, expecting to see the men behind him again, but the forest remained still. He strained his ears, listening. Another crack echoed from the darkness. This one closer. His heart began to race. They were still looking for him. Kofi crouched low and slipped behind a thick tree. He pressed his body flat against the bark and held his breath. He scanned the shadows, waiting to see movement, waiting for the men to appear. But instead of voices or footsteps, he heard something else. A slow, heavy sound, like breathing. A rustle in the grass. A low grunt. It was not a human. It was an animal. Kofi's fear multiplied. The forest at night was full of creatures, some harmless, others not. His grandmother used to describe them in stories. Bush pigs, wild dogs, and even the occasional leopard passing through the deeper parts of the forest. Kofi prayed silently that whatever stood nearby would ignore him. The rustling came closer. Then the creature stepped into the moonlight. A bushbuck, a large forest antelope, stood a few meters away. Its horns curved gracefully, and its coat shone under the pale moon. Its ears flicked back and forth, listening for predators. Kofi stayed completely still, afraid that any movement might startle the animal and send it crashing through the trees, alerting the herdsman. For a few moments, boy and animal shared the clearing. The bushbuck sniffed the air, decided there was no threat from Kofi, and slowly disappeared into the tall grass. Kofi waited until the sound of its footsteps faded before moving again. He felt a small wave of relief, but he also knew the forest held many things, some peaceful, some deadly, and some, like the herdsman, far worse than animals. He continued walking, guided by the faint glow of the moon. The forest floor sloped upward, and soon Kofi found himself climbing a small hill. At the top, the trees thinned, revealing a wide view of the woods below. For the first time since he fled, he felt slightly higher than his fears. He looked around, trying to remember the landscape. His grandmother once took him to the farmlands and told him the village sat between two hills. If he could find those hills, he could find home. Kofi turned his gaze to the horizon. Far away, beyond the trees, a faint line of pale light was rising. Dawn was coming. The sky slowly shifted from deep black to gentle blue. The stars dimmed one by one, retreating into the sky. A soft breeze passed through the forest, bringing with it the cool scent of morning. Kofi felt hope rise again. The darkness was losing its strength. With the morning sun, he would be able to see the paths clearly. Maybe he could reach the village before the herdsman realized he had changed direction. But just as he started down the hill, he saw something that made the hope crumble instantly. Footprints. Fresh ones. Large, heavy, deep in the soil. The prints trailed across the slope, disappearing into the trees below. They were too big to belong to a child, and the spacing showed they belonged to someone walking fast. Kofi's heart tightened. The herdsmen were still out here, and they were close. He swallowed hard and looked around. He needed to pick a direction that would confuse anyone tracking him. If he continued straight down the hill, they might find him. If he doubled back, he risked crossing their path. If he wandered randomly, he might lose precious time. He knelt and pressed his hand against the soil. The ground was cold. The prints were fresh. The men had passed through minutes ago. Kofi realized something important. They were not heading toward him. They were moving ahead of him, deeper into the forest. They thought he had run in a different direction. This was his chance. He stood quickly and turned away from the footprints. He walked carefully, avoiding areas with loose soil. He stepped on rocks when possible to hide his tracks. The forest began to brighten as the first rays of sunlight reached the ground. Birds started singing. Monkeys chattered in distant trees. The forest slowly awakened. The light gave Kofi strength. He picked up his pace, moving quickly but quietly, determined not to lose the advantage he had gained. As he walked, he heard something familiar, a distant sound, soft but unmistakable. It was the gentle murmur of flowing water, a river or stream. His grandmother once told him that rivers often led to villages, farms, or paths used by hunters. If he followed the water long enough, he might find his way out. Kofi hurried toward the sound. The forest opened into a small riverside clearing. Water sparkled under the early sun, flowing calmly over smooth stones. The riverbank looked familiar. Kofi knelt beside the water and washed his face. The coldness revived him. He stood up again and looked around carefully. Then he saw it. A broken tree trunk lying across the river path. He remembered it. He had passed it once while going with his grandmother to pick palm fruits. He was close to home. Excitement surged through him, but he forced himself to stay calm. The herdsmen were still in the forest, and one wrong move could lead him straight into their hands again. Kofi turned toward the path leading home. He took a deep breath. He stepped forward. But before he could walk far, he heard a sound behind him, a slow, deliberate step. Someone was standing at the edge of the trees, someone who had been watching him. Kofi's blood turned cold the moment he heard the step behind him. It was soft but heavy, the kind of step taken by someone who knew exactly how to move without making noise. The forest grew silent again, as if every creature sensed what stood nearby. Kofi slowly turned his head toward the trees. A shadow shifted between the branches. A tall figure stepped out. At first, Kofi thought it was the herdsman, and fear shot through him like lightning. His knees weakened and his breath caught in his throat. But as the figure stepped fully into the morning light, he realized it was not the same man. It was someone else. The man standing before him was older, with gray streaks in his beard and a broad walking staff in his hand. His clothes looked worn but clean, the kind of clothing worn by farmers or hunters. His expression was unreadable, but his eyes studied Kofi intently. Kofi froze, unsure if this new stranger was a friend or another danger. The man lifted his hand slowly, signaling Kofi to stay calm. His movements were gentle, not aggressive. He stepped closer, scanning the boy from head to toe. Kofi's torn clothes, the scratches on his arms, and the dried blood on his wrists told a story even without words. The man finally spoke, but Kofi did not hear his words clearly. His ears were filled with the pounding of his own heartbeat. He only understood one thing. The man was asking him what happened. Kofi tried to speak, but his voice cracked. He swallowed hard and forced himself to explain. He told the man about the herdsman, about the lie, about being dragged through the forest, about the hut, the rope, the escape, the The men searching, the long night of running. He told everything in a trembling voice. The man listened carefully, his face growing darker with every detail. When Kofi finished, the man looked toward the deeper woods, where the herdsman had vanished. His grip tightened on the walking staff. Something flickered in his eyes, anger, concern, maybe both. He placed a steadying hand on Kofi's shoulder and pointed toward the river path. The gesture was clear. The man wanted to lead him home. But just as they prepared to move, Kofi heard something that made his stomach twist. Voices, distant but approaching. Two men arguing, the sound drifting through the trees like smoke. Kofi recognized the tone. He recognized the sharpness in one of the voices. It was the herdsman. They had discovered his escape trail. They were following it, and they were close. The older man heard it too. He pulled Kofi behind a tall tree and pressed a finger to his lips, instructing him to stay silent. Together, they crouched low behind the trunk, listening as the voices grew louder. The herdsman shouted angrily, accusing his partner of losing the trail. The partner insisted the boy must be somewhere near. Their footsteps crushed fallen leaves as they searched the area. Kofi's heart hammered in his chest. He clutched the man's cloth tightly, terrified that the herdsman would step into the clearing and spot them. The older man leaned forward slightly, watching the two kidnappers through the trees. His jaw tightened. Kofi could tell he was judging their distance, their behavior, their weapons. The man was no ordinary farmer. He moved with the awareness of someone who had survived many dangers. The footsteps came closer. The bush rustled. A shadow crossed the patch of sunlight near them. Kofi held his breath so tightly his chest burned. Then, without warning, the older man grabbed Kofi's hand and pulled him away from the hiding spot, not toward the path home, but deeper into the trees. Kofi looked confused, but the man's grip told him there was no time to question it. The two moved quickly but silently, weaving between thick bushes and ducking under low branches. The older man didn't run in straight lines. He moved in a winding path, the way hunters walked when trying to confuse animals. Kofi realized he was intentionally avoiding leaving footprints. Behind them, the herdsmen's voices grew faint, then loud again, then faint. They were going in circles, confused by the changing trail. The older man stopped near a cluster of large, moss-covered rocks. He guided Kofi behind them and knelt beside him. He whispered softly, explaining that running straight home would lead the kidnappers to the village. The men would follow the path and might attack or kidnap again. Kofi's chest tightened with worry. He had not even thought about the danger the herdsmen posed to others. The man looked at him with steady eyes. He told Kofi that they needed to throw the kidnappers off completely. They needed to mislead them, then loop back toward the village from another direction. Kofi nodded, trusting the man despite his fear. The older man waited until the forest settled again. When the voices drifted farther away, he signaled Kofi to follow. They moved carefully, stepping only where the man stepped, avoiding soft soil and broken branches that might reveal their path. Minutes turned into an hour. The sun rose higher, casting warm light across the forest. Birds chirped again. The forest returned to life, but Kofi remained tense. They reached another stream, smaller than the first. The man stepped into it, walking through the water with slow, deliberate strides. He motioned for Kofi to do the same. The flowing water washed away their footprints instantly. After walking for several minutes, the man stepped out onto firm ground. He pointed ahead. The trees grew thinner in that direction. Kofi recognized the gradual change. He knew this part of the forest. They were close to the farmlands near his village. A sudden rush of emotion filled his chest. Relief, exhaustion, hope. But before he could take another step, the older man placed a hand on his shoulder and stopped him. The man pointed to the ground. Fresh footprints. Not one pair. 3. Kofi's breath caught. More kidnappers were in the area, or someone else entirely. The man crouched to examine the prints. His expression grew serious. Kofi waited, trembling. Finally, the man stood up slowly, and Kofi understood from the look on his face. The danger was not over. The forest held more threats than he knew. Someone else was watching the path ahead. The older man stared at the footprints with a seriousness that made Kofi's skin crawl. The forest was quiet again, but the quiet did not feel peaceful. It felt heavy, tense, thick with the presence of someone unseen. The birds around them had gone silent. and the wind seemed to hesitate before passing through the leaves. Kofi bent down and studied the footprints too. They were clear in the soft soil, pointing in different directions, as if the owners had been searching or patrolling. There were 3 sets in total, and they looked fresh, too fresh. The older man tapped the ground lightly with his staff, thinking. His eyes scanned the surrounding trees. He whispered that these were not the footprints of farmers. They were not villagers returning home. These prints had been made by men who moved with purpose, men who were searching for something, or someone. Kofi felt fear tighten around him like a rope. It was possible that these footprints belonged to more kidnappers. Perhaps the herdsman had partners spread throughout the forest. Perhaps they had been waiting for him all along. The older man breathed deeply and motioned for Kofi to stay close behind him. Instead of walking straight toward the village path, he led the boy off to the side, cutting through a group of thick shrubs. He moved silently, stepping carefully on roots and stones that would not leave impressions. Kofi followed closely, copying the man's movements. He felt as if the forest itself had turned into a giant puzzle, and every wrong step could lead them into a trap. As they walked, the trees began to open slightly. A gentle light filtered through the branches, revealing a small clearing. The clearing was circular, surrounded by tall grass that swayed lightly in the morning breeze. In the center of the clearing lay patches of trampled grass, broken sticks, and scattered leaves. The older man stopped abruptly and raised his hand for Kofi to halt. Kofi looked ahead, and soon he understood why the man had stopped. In the clearing stood 3 men. They carried long sticks and wore dark clothes that blended with the forest. Their movements were slow, controlled, and observant. They scanned the area the way hunters scanned for animals, checking every patch of earth, every bush, every broken twig. Kofi's mouth went dry. These were not random travelers. They were watching the forest with intention, and they were standing in the direction Kofi and the older man needed to go. The older man crouched low and pulled Kofi behind a tree. Kofi pressed his back against the bark, his heart thudding wildly. The older man whispered that the men were trackers. He explained that experienced trackers could follow a person through the forest by noticing even the smallest signs: bent grass, disturbed soil, snapped twigs, misplaced stones. Kofi glanced at the men again. They moved with precision, inspecting the ground as if reading a map drawn in dirt. The older man told Kofi that if they continued forward, they would be spotted. The men were too close. The area was too open. Any movement would give them away. Kofi's breathing quickened. He whispered softly, asking what they would do. The older man scanned the surroundings and pointed toward the far left side of the clearing. There was a fallen tree there, partly hidden by tall grass. Behind the fallen tree, a narrow slope dipped into another stretch of the forest. If they reached that slope, they could move around the clearing and avoid the trackers entirely. But getting there would require crossing a small section of open ground, a space where a single wrong movement could catch the attention of the men in the clearing. The older man thought for a moment, then placed his walking staff gently on the ground. He adjusted his stance and told Kofi that he would distract the trackers. Kofi shook his head in fear, insisting that they stay together. But the older man's expression remained calm yet firm. He reminded Kofi that he was a child and had more to lose. The older man had survived the forest for years. He understood its dangers and how to manipulate them. Kofi hesitated, torn between fear and trust. The older man placed a hand on Kofi's shoulder and whispered that courage is not the absence of fear, but the decision to continue despite it. He told Kofi that this moment was where he must be brave. Before Kofi could say anything, the older man stood up slowly, still hidden by the trees. He picked up a small stone and threw it into a bush far opposite their hiding spot. The stone rustled the leaves, and the sound echoed softly across the clearing. The 3 trackers turned their heads immediately. The older man threw another stone, this time farther into the trees. The trackers grew suspicious and moved toward the sound, stepping away from the center of the clearing. Now was the chance. The older man whispered sharply to Kofi to run. Kofi slipped quickly from behind the tree, crouching low as he dashed toward the fallen log. His heart pounded as he crossed the open ground. Every sound felt too loud. The grass brushed against his legs, and his breath came fast and shaky. He reached the fallen tree and hid behind it, trembling. He turned back to look for the older man. The older man stood a few meters away, still hidden behind a tree. He waited until the trackers moved deeper into the opposite side of the clearing. Then, as he prepared to join Kofi, something unexpected happened. A fourth man emerged from the trees behind him. He stepped out quietly, holding a long stick. His eyes locked onto the older man instantly, his expression sharp and calculating. Kofi's heart dropped. This man had not been in the clearing earlier. He had been hiding, watching silently from the shadows. And now he had caught the older man off guard. The older man turned, surprised, but the stranger raised his hand quickly, signaling the others. Kofi watched in horror as the trackers turned back toward the clearing, alerted by the silent signal of their hidden partner. The older man was surrounded. He took a step back, gripping his staff tightly, preparing for what was coming. And Kofi realized with rising dread that the men had not simply been searching the forest, they had been waiting. The moment the hidden tracker stepped out behind the older man, Kofi felt the world drop from beneath his feet. The forest, once filled with danger he nearly escaped, now seemed to fold in on him again. The older man stood alone, surrounded on all sides by the hunters. Their formation was tight, their eyes cold, their intentions unmistakable. Kofi pressed himself lower behind the fallen tree, his chest trembling. He wanted to scream, to shout a warning, to distract them, to do something. But fear held him still. His throat felt closed, and his body refused to move. He could only watch. The older man gripped his walking staff with both hands. His posture shifted, steady and firm. Although outnumbered, there was no fear in his eyes. He stood like someone who had survived many storms and was prepared to face one more. The hunters tightened their circle around him. Their leader, the man who had stepped out last, studied the older man with a calculating expression. He gestured toward the forest, signaling two of the trackers to spread out and scan the surrounding area. He expected the boy to be close. Kofi watched silently as one of the trackers began walking toward the fallen tree where he hid. Panic surged in him. The grass rustled softly as the man approached. One more step, then another. The hunter's boots crushed the leaves, bringing him dangerously close. Kofi felt the older man's voice in his memory. Courage is not the absence of fear, but the decision to continue despite it. The older man seemed to sense Kofi's panic from afar. He tapped his staff loudly against the ground. The sharp sound cut through the clearing. All the hunters turned their eyes toward him. Even the one walking toward Kofi stopped and looked back. The older man lifted his chin and spoke in a steady voice that carried through the trees. He told the hunters to leave the boy alone. He told them the forest already knew their wickedness, and it would not hide them forever. His words angered the leader. The man stepped forward and raised his stick threateningly. The hunters adjusted their stance, ready to strike. But the older man moved first. With surprising speed, he spun the staff in his hands and struck the leader's arm, forcing the man to drop his stick. The hunters were momentarily stunned. The older man struck again, sweeping the legs of another tracker and sending him crashing to the ground. Kofi watched with wide eyes. The older man fought with skill and strength far beyond what his age suggested. But there were too many hunters, and they were quick to recover. One of them charged from behind and grabbed the older man's shoulder. Another struck his ribs with a heavy blow. The older man staggered but did not fall. He swung the staff again, but this time his arm moved slower, weakened from the hits. The hunters closed in. Kofi's vision blurred with fear. Tears formed in his eyes. He wanted to run to the older man, but he knew he would only get captured too. The older man looked toward the fallen tree, toward Kofi, and shook his head slightly, telling him without words, "Do not come out. Run." The hunter struck again. The older man fell to one knee, his staff dropping to the ground. His breath came in short, painful bursts. The leader walked up to him and raised his foot to strike. But the forest interrupted. A faint horn echoed in the distance. Sharp, urgent, familiar. Kofi recognized the sound instantly. It was the village horn of Abram, the call used only in times of danger. The villagers had realized Kofi was missing, and they were coming. Voices followed the horn. Many voices. Footsteps rushed through the forest. The hunters stiffened. Their leader's expression changed from confidence to worry. The sound of multiple people approaching grew louder, closer, stronger. The hunters panicked. One of them grabbed the older man and tried to pull him away, but the older man resisted fiercely, holding the man's leg to slow him down. The leader shouted for them to retreat. The forest erupted in confusion as they scrambled to gather their tools. Kofi watched as they dragged the older man a few steps, but the villagers were too close. Shouting voices filled the woods. Sticks, cutlasses, and torches glowed between the trees as men stormed forward. The hunters abandoned their attempt to take the older man. They ran into the deeper forest, slipping away before the villagers could catch sight of them. The man they dragged fell back to the ground, gasping for air. Kofi broke from his hiding place. He sprinted toward the older man, collapsing at his side. Tears streamed down his cheeks as he called out to him. The older man opened his eyes slowly, his breathing shallow but steady. He placed a hand on Kofi's arm gently, reassuring him. Within moments, the villagers arrived. Among them was Mama Essie, her wrapper half-tied and her feet dusty from running barefoot. When she saw Kofi, she let out a cry that shattered the silence of the forest. She rushed to him, pulling him tightly into her arms. She held him so close that he felt the tremble in her body. She whispered prayers of gratitude repeatedly, her voice shaking. The villagers quickly helped the older man to his feet. They supported him on both sides as they began to make their way back home. Kofi stayed close to him, refusing to leave his side. The walk back to Abram felt long. The morning sun had risen fully now, painting the land with warm light. As the village came into view, women rushed out, placing their hands on their heads in shock. Men clenched their fists, anger rising at the thought of strangers entering their forest to hunt a child. When they reached the village square, the chief's elders arrived. They listened as Kofi told his story from beginning to end. Everyone stood in silence, shaken by what they heard. The chief stepped forward and declared that no child would enter the forest alone again. He ordered men to patrol the borders for the next few weeks. The villagers murmured in agreement, vowing to protect their own. Later that evening, after the commotion settled, Mama Essie sat with Kofi under the baobab tree. She held his hand gently and told him that trust was like fire. In the right place, it gave warmth, but in the wrong place, it burned everything. Kofi nodded slowly, understanding the truth deeply now. He survived because he found courage. He escaped because he listened to the signs. He lived because a stranger chose to help him. But the lesson remained clear. Not every smile was safe. Not every hand offered was kind. Not everyone who approached deserved trust. The forest may forget the footsteps of the hunters, but Kofi never would. And from that day on, the children of Abram walked the forest paths with wiser eyes, remembering the boy who escaped the shadows.